Welcome back to Houston Real Estate Radio. I'm your host, Shannon Register, and every week we bring you news and information you can use on your next real estate transaction. And it is real estate transaction season. We have seen so many properties going on the market and flying right back off the market this selling season. Having a lot of fun over at Register Real Estate Advisors with buyers and sellers. And the thing is, when you buy and sell a property, you got to look at the title insurance. You got to have you're going to close at a title company, and you're going to have title insurance to ensure it that the property changes hands correctly, and you're going to need a title company. So I recommend that you put Chicago Title on your contract. Tell your realtors use Chicago Title. They do a great job for me and my agents over here at RREA. And have a lot of fun using Chicago Title. I've got two of the people from Chicago Title here today to talk to you about some really fun things. So welcome to the show. I've got Susan Strickland. Susan Strickland is a commercial closing attorney, and Steve Sapio, who's the vice president of Chicago Title Houston. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, we're going to talk about something really fun today, something that most people need to be aware of, the fact that Texas is a community property state. And, this is something that when you've moved from another state, you really need to be aware of it, don't you think?
Yes.
It really changes everything. So, Susan, tell me about community property. Texas is a community property state. What does that mean?
Basically, community property is the legal concept that explains how married people own property. And the way that they own it is that each has what's called an undivided one-half interest. And when you say undivided, that means 50% of the whole. Not that you draw a line down the middle and one has the left side and one has the right side, but you each have 50% of the whole.
All right, very good. So let's talk about how this really works. When you're going through divorce, I know it's really important. Tell me, community property is so important for your homestead, the house that you live in together. How does it affect the other properties you have, like your investment properties, or does it?
Anything that you acquire during marriage is presumed to be community property, whether it's what we call real property, dirt, and improvements affixed to the dirt, personal property, anything that can be removed, vehicles, equipment, what have you, money, investment accounts, anything that can be owned can be community property.
Is there anything that it doesn't apply to?
Yes, property that is inherited, property that you own before you get married, and property that is gifted to one spouse and not the other during marriage.
Okay. All right. So with property that you had in a previous marriage or you had previously when you were single, once you move your spouse into it, though, does that change it?
There's a big difference. When yes, the property remains what's called your separate property, in the sense that the ownership does not change. But once you bring a spouse onto that property, then two things change. One is that any increase in value of the property, even though it's separate, that increase in value is community property. The other thing is, even if it's separate property owned by only one spouse, if you've got the other spouse living there with you, then it becomes the homestead of the non-owning spouse. And under the Texas Constitution, you can't get rid of your spouse's homestead without their consent. So if you were to sell that,
it might as well be community property.
There you go. So if you were going to sell that, then even if it was separate property, the spouse needs to join in, the non-owning spouse.
Okay. Why is it important to distinguish between community property and separate property?
Well, most of the time when things are going well, it doesn't matter. Each spouse owes a duty of support to the other, and they share, and you don't much think about it. But when there's some kind of separation, either divorce or death, then that's when it becomes important, because the community property estate, if you want to call it that you have owned in community ownership, it's inheritable. So once one spouse dies, then who gets the community property?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
That's the issue.
Go ahead, Steve.
Separate property and community property and descent and distribution is a broad inheritance. If you're having community property and as of 1993 and your children are of that marriage, then you would have everything that would go to the spouse. If it's separate property, you have to go look at going back to your children and maybe up the what do you call it? It's not ascendants.
Okay.
When you're dealing with separate property, your inheritance would be different.
It gets a lot more complicated when people start remarrying, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
All right, more reason to have some paperwork in place for that,
Absolutely.
I guess, right? Yeah. All right. So if you are married, but you've got some investment properties, can one person buy and sell those investment properties, or do both people need to sign off on it, even though it's not their homestead? Because it's a community property state, do both have to sign off on it, or can one person be buying and selling properties?
There's a concept of what's called sole management and control community property if title is held in only one of the spouses. If the deed by which they got ownership is just in one and not the other, then whichever one has title can deal with that property separately if it is not homestead. Now, that's the law. However, title companies don't often, sometimes what they do is not follow the law. They look more at the possibility of risk or challenge.
Yeah.
And it's quite possible that even if the property is in the name of one spouse, that the title company will say the other has a community property interest, we still require their joinder, even if it's not homestead, because we just don't want to fight on our hands.
Yeah.
So you will find some title companies take that position.
All right. So how is the sale of a married person's separate property handled? Like if they are kind of what you just talked about, but is there anything in place to show that it's separate property? So for example, do you have to have legal documents showing it's separate property, or the fact that it was inherited by one of them just makes it separate property?
The facts decide whether or not the property is community or separate.
Okay.
Whether or not those facts can be gleaned from an examination of title depends on the situation.
Okay.
If you bought the property in 1980, you didn't marry till 1990, obviously it's your separate property. If it came to you by will, and that will is filed of record in the real property records, or there's a deed from the executor to the heir in the real property records, then you know that. And nothing further needs to be done.
All right. So when you have couples who are getting a divorce and they've got, they own all this property together, how do you handle that? Carefully.
The first thing that you do is, the golden rule is, they're not divorced until they're divorced. So it's still community property. Under certain circumstances, that they enter into a community property division agreement as part of their divorce, that can be done in advance of the final decree. Many title companies will honor that, and both will sell. They'll split the proceeds accordingly. They're often asked to, title company, hold the sales proceeds in escrow until we know what the final decree is going to be and who gets what money. Some title companies will do that for you, and some will not. Mainly because many divorces can be protracted, and we don't often like to hold money for more than a few months at a time. So that's a case-by-case basis with your title company.
So what happens when a spouse dies in a community property circumstance? Depends on if they have a will or not.
As from an examination standpoint, first thing we would look for is to find out if there's been a probate filed. So as we were talking about in another segment, having a will, the best thing to do obviously would be to probate it. Examiner's going to order the probate, read it, and vest title per the probate, and make any kind of requirements that it's necessary, as set out in that probate.
All right. Well, I'm glad y'all do this for a living and not me, because it sounds like it gets a little bit complicated. I know you guys deal with a lot of folks, and people. I'm sure people try to sneak it past you sometimes. They're in the middle of a divorce and don't tell you, don't they? But you can find that out, right?
Yes, we can. Once that divorce is filed for record, then that proceeding is something that is within our scope of title searching, and we will find it out.
All right. Sounds good. We are talking today with Chicago Title. The Chicago Title title that I like to use is over on Cypresswood because it's close to my office. A lot of my agents use those guys. They do a great job over there. If you're buying or selling property, you can request to use Chicago Title. They also have locations throughout Houston. The one over on Cypresswood, you're hearing from today, Susan Strickland and Steve Sapio from Chicago Title over on Cypresswood, and their number at their office is 281-469-8200. So you can call and get any of your title questions answered. 281-469-8200. Thanks so much, Steve and Susan. We appreciate you coming on the show.
You're welcome.
We'll be right back here on Houston Real Estate Radio.
People often find themselves in need of storage and moving, but don't want the hassle and stress. Sound familiar? Well, at Zippy Shell, we make storage and moving easy. Zippy Shell will deliver a storage container to your home or business. You load it at your leisure, and we'll take it to one of our safe, convenient storage facilities, or ship it to your final destination. We treat your stuff like it's our stuff, because we understand you're not just giving us your belongings, you're giving us your trust. Zippy Shell, storage and moving that makes life simple.